More on this, we're now being joined by Scott Lucas, a professor of international politics and an international affairs analyst. He's joining us live from Wicklow in Ireland. Welcome to the programme. So how do you assess the extent of the economic warfare, I should say, that's been waged by the US against Iran?
Well, the statement by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is actually more psychological pressure than it is an accurate statement. In fact, the pressure on Iran's economy from the Trump administration goes back to 2018, which is when they pulled out of the 2015 agreement to limit Iran's nuclear program. And then 6 months later, they introduced comprehensive sanctions. Now, those comprehensive sanctions have hindered Iran's oil exports, but they haven't stopped them. And in fact, contrary to what Bessent said, Iran's oil exports are roughly around at the same level as they have been throughout 2025. That's not where the pressure has come on the Iranian economy. And similarly, Iran has been cut off from the international financial system, cut off from the SWIFT transaction system since 2018. So that's not what was the catalyst for the protests that we saw at the end of last year. Rather, there, in combination with the U.S. sanctions, which had been there for years, there was the damage from Israel's 12-day war on Iran, which was quite destructive inside the country, quite destabilizing, and then it was mismanagement. One of Iran's leading banks collapsed last autumn with the loss of billions of dollars. So what you have is a story in which U.S. pressure is part of this, but it's more of this involving also pressure from Israel and also from problems inside Iran, including with the leadership. And I think that's important to note because a lot of people, especially Iran's regime, will try to get out of their predicament by saying the protests were simply caused by the United States. That way they can say that the people should rally against Donald Trump, when in fact the protests by Iranians were not caused by the United States. They were about long-standing economic and political issues with this regime going back to the late 1990s.
Right. Okay, well, it's interesting what you say then, a combination of factors, and all of this as talks are set to resume in an attempt to avoid a military conflict. I mean, how do you see these talks going?
Well, I think from the American side, it's similar to the pressure tactics that was put on Venezuela until they finally decided to kidnap President Nicolas Maduro in January. And that is, you put a military force off the coast and then you say, all right, you better talk to us. Now, in the Venezuelan case, that culminated with other members of the Maduro government giving up the president and, in effect, regime accommodation. In other words, the U.S. is still dealing with the Maduro government, albeit without Maduro. Now, with Iran, what you've got here is I don't think the U.S. is going to be able to kidnap the supreme leader. And the Iranian regime, which is a very repressive regime, a destructive regime, still is relatively intact despite the recent protest. So I'm not sure how America breaks the Iranian regime through the combination of threat and talks. But from the regime's point of view, they're playing for time. They've just survived weeks of protest by killing thousands, maybe tens of thousands of their people. They have a serious economic situation. They don't want another attack on their military and nuclear facilities, so they go through the talks. Do I actually think that's going to lead to an agreement? Highly doubtful.
Well, indeed. I mean, it's difficult to predict, isn't it? And how serious could a military conflict be for the region and indeed the world?
Well, I think it would be a case not only of causing destruction inside Iran on top of, let's say, the self-inflicted destruction that we've seen by the regime. You would have destruction throughout the region. Israel's attack on Iran did not come without cost to the Israelis, but more importantly, it threatened instability in places like Iraq, like Syria, like Yemen, like Lebanon, and even in Palestine. And I think the one thing that is probably holding the Trump administration back from simply firing some missiles on military and nuclear installations right now is the prospects that while Iran, I don't think, can directly match U.S. firepower, the consequences in other countries are so serious that Gulf states are telling the Americans, don't do this.
Scott Lucas, we very much appreciate your insights. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you and your viewers.